introduce our speaker for this morning. Um, Arturo Joseph Tita Blan III is an MA student at the University of the Philippines Archaeological Studies program. He received his bachelor's degree at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, in a joint specialization in anthropology and sociology and a minor in classical archaeology. He has recently joined the RSGIS laboratory as a research assistant, has joined CAPI as an associate member, and is the head of the ArchiSoc Publicity Committee. His background in multiple disciplines and interests in the intersections of identity and archaeology drew him to today's topic. And I'm sure a lot of you already know, if you're a weekly viewer of BINALOT Talk, he is also a co-moderator, but for today, he will be chatting about his research. So please take it away, JJ.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, so as Anna mentioned, I am a co-host turned speaker, and I'm actually speaking about a topic that I spoke about earlier in the pandemic. Yeah, this is a topic that I actually spoke about earlier in the pandemic. This was a paper that I wrote back in July or August of 2020, so right in the midst of the pandemic. So it's very fitting that this paper gets presented here in the online version of the BINALOTs. It's a paper that I've grown to really, really love, even though the topic, has infinitely attracted me since the beginning, but only through its rewrites, originally presenting it in CASA, and then having it in the process of being published later in February of next year, have I really, really gone to love and enjoy this paper. Yeah, so this paper is looking at Fiji and looking at how the people came to be and sort of trying to identify what the identity of the Fijian people are. Now, I'm not going to make any grand assumptions, not going to make any grand statements about, speaking for the Fijian people, but there have been numerous amounts of studies being done on the islands of Fiji. People studying its language, its people, the genetic history, the archaeology, the paleo environments. A lot of these disciplines often, intersecting with one another, don't often actually, or should I say, they actually do to some extent. But what I tried to attempt with this paper was to really engage with them as if, they were all on equal footing. So with that being said, there's an initial disclaimer that I want to make. A lot of the terms used in early reference to the islands in the Pacific have a lot of racialized and dark past in their usage. Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia all have been historically racially charged. Although its modern usage tends to be more towards cultural and more cultural terminologies. There's still some reservations about their usage in more academic spaces. Although these terms have been slowly reclaimed by the people that were once used, in which these terms were used against. But yeah, it's still a rather touchy subject, to say the least, in their usage in academic spaces. So I will be using them in reference to specific in specific instances, such as in the genetic studies, mostly due to the fact that that's what the language that they use. I'll try to avoid it as much as I can because I don't want to add to that discourse. But just as a fair warning, that's something that will happen in this talk. So this presentation, again, highlights a lot of different aspects of the studies being done and research being done in Fiji. Although, with the pandemic, a lot of these studies have been slowed down and halted. And there's actually, I've been following some news in Fiji, and there has been some, political unrest I haven't delved too deep into that, but that's something that I want to highlight in these difficult times. But yeah, a lot of the interesting studies being done on Fiji, have to do with genetics, linguistics, zooarchaeology, archaeology. I also forgot to include archaeobotany and a little bit of um, ethnoarchaeology and cultural anthropology. So there is, this wide breadth of studies being done within Fiji that has already been established. But with that being said, there's still much more for us to uncover um, in studying Fiji. So why Fiji in the first place? Out of all the Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesian islands in the throughout the Pacific, why did I pick Fiji? Well, what was interesting to me is that in the next slide I'll show you specifically, but within all the sort of island, the geographic locations of the islands in Fiji, um, it or geographic setting of the Pacific, Fiji played a really central role in its placement. So the migration of oceanic people went from west to east, and then also a little bit of uh, sort of return voyages to and from. But Fiji almost looks like, and I would argue, plays a central role in the movement of people. And then also looking at inter and intra Fijian island networks, it plays a really, really fascinating role in that the islands of Fiji all have contact with one another at various points in its history. They traded with one another, and although they develop sort of distinct cultural identities, there is still some of this pan-Fijian identity, shared culture, shared language, and we'll also see shortly a shared genetic heritage. But that's not to say that the greater Pacific was excluded from that. You'll see a lot of networks with regions from the east, regions from the west, and so on and so forth. So Fiji, I would argue, is a very important location in the Pacific. So for those of us who study uh, island Southeast Asia, we are all very familiar with the Austronesian expansion. The Austronesian expansion, according to Bellwood, and particularly his out of Taiwan hypothesis, posits that Proto-Austronesian speaking people, who would have originated from Taiwan, migrated out of Taiwan, moving into island Southeast Asia, and then into the greater Pacific, and even as far as Madagascar. While there's currently still a lot of debate about this, the particular strain that we will be following would have gone through the Philippines, gone through Papua New Guinea, and then gone through here in Fiji. Now, the different colors are according to the current hypothesis of the movements of these Austronesian migrants, and sort of looking at the different timetables. So as you can see, the red being the sort of earliest movements, followed swiftly by the purple, and then the green and sort of yellow tangentially, and then later, or sort of in conjunction with that eastern movement, the western movement into Madagascar. But again, we'll be primarily focusing on this purple region, and more specifically, this little red circled area, which is the Central Pacific region, which includes Fiji. Now, these are the islands of Fiji, roughly 300-ish, but only about 100 of them are actually inhabited. So as you can see, there are a bunch of different islands, but the most important of those, a lot have argued, is Viti Levu. Now, of course, there are secondary islands that play importances as well, but we'll see later on that Viti Levu, this big central island, is quite unique in in contrast to the other regions of Fiji. So with that being stated, let's dive straight into the genetic history. Now, I have to preface this, as my background sort of alludes, I am not a geneticist. So a lot of the genetic history of Fiji was something that I had to corroborate with. And actually, I was in contact with one of the main authors that I use, Gerard Shipley. Although he's currently shifted away from Fijian genetics, he was able to give a quick read through and sort of look at some of the statements that I made according to his paper, and he said that they were right. So I'll take his word for it. But yeah, one of the important things about Fijian genetics is that we could trace lineages according to Y chromosome and mtDNA evidence. So Y chromosomes represent the father's lineages, and mtDNA, or mitochondrial DNA, represents the mother's lineage. And these are really, really important to sort of to understand the makeup of the populations of Fiji, because of the fact that most residency practices among the Pacific Islanders are matrilocal, meaning that it is the mother's household, which is the permanent household of the family, and it's the father that moves in. So you would sort of see a general trend of mtDNA evidence being somewhat similar, while the Y chromosomes can be a little bit more diverse. Now, with that being said, this very helpful diagram that Shipley et al. Produced, shows just that. Now he sort of divided Fiji into 5 primary groups for his genetic study. Now, although his sample sizes weren't that significant or that big, I think it's a good start for studies like this to be conducted, because generally, although there have been some significant studies about the genetic makeup of Pacific Islanders, a lot of them tend to be overgeneralized and look at the broad strokes of things and not look at the nitty gritty and the very, very pertinent and very personal stories of these people. For instance, a lot of the early genetic studies that are foundational to the genetic histories of Pacific Islanders treated Fiji as a single population group. Now, while that has certain value in the grand scheme of Polynesian peoples, of Pacific Islanders, it doesn't really talk about the nuance which Shipley et al. Encountered. So as you can see here, these pie charts all show varying degrees of either a gray color or a black color. Now, the gray color would represent Melanesian haplogroups, meaning that these haplogroups found on either the mtDNA, which is the right circle, or the Y chromosome, the left circle, are more closely related to affinities found with the region of Melanesia. So moving back here, the island of Melanesia is over here, or the islands of Melanesia are closer to here, and then the islands of Polynesia over here. So let's just move back. Yes. So, looking at that affinity, we could really, really trace and see where in the movement of not only, well, it can be hard to distinguish initial immigrants to the Fijian Isles, according to modern DNA, but we could sort of see where that where the continued occupation of these isles, where do these affinities lie closest to. Now, as you could see, a general trend amongst the Y chromosomes show a general trend more closely related to Melanesia when it comes to the fathers, and Polynesian when it comes to the mothers. Now that sort of makes sense when you think of the movements of people, because looking at the movement of people, um, the migrants coming from Melanesia into Fiji would have been later in date, and sort of would have diverged earlier from the Melanesian populations. So they would be closely related down the line to their neighbors to the east, the Tongans and the Samoans, but also to their later sort of cousins, the very, very big haplogroups and cultural peoples known as the Polynesians. So it's a very, very complicated history, and I basically summarized that in very short terms, because again, a lot of the genetics and nitty-gritty of the genetics is something that I, in all honesty, still don't fully comprehend. But I think that was that was the best summary I could do without delving too much into that. But now the linguistics. So the linguistics also share a very, very interesting story. Now, when I originally presented this, even though this table seems outlines a very fairly standard evolutionary historical linguistic tree, it's actually a lot more complicated than I initially thought. And I have Dr. Andrew Pauly so much to thank for his revisions over my paper, because there was a lot that I initially missed, not being a historical linguist in my initial run through of that material. So although you could generally trace this sort of historical linguistic tree, so moving from Proto-Austronesian to Proto-Eastern Oceanic, Proto-Central Pacific, Proto-Fijian, and then the Eastern and Western communal X. It's actually much more complicated than that. There's some borrowings amongst both dialects with current Polynesian languages. There are distinct linguistic evolutions of both Eastern and Western. They both share distinct lexical items and grammatical forms from Proto-Polynesian, and there are even some inclusions that Eastern shares with Eastern communal X share with Proto-Polynesian and the subsequent Polynesian languages, but not with the Western. So again, this is a very short summary, because again, I'm still coming to terms with all that revelation, all these revelations that Dr. Pauly sort of provided me. But yeah, it's a much more complicated story than I initially looked at, and I still need a lot more studying to do upon this. But yeah, it just comes to show that not only is there a lot of things left to be studied in Fiji, but it also shows the intricate nature of its culture, of its people, of its language, and of its genetics. Now, to sort of circle back to the sort of genetic studies, one particular interesting fact of VT Levu is that although it was treated as a single genetic group, the sort of island mountain range sort of divides the island in two. Now, this huge mountain range, sort of located at the central part of VT Levu, actually is what is the separating line between Western and Eastern communal X. So, as the name indicates, everything west of this island range, plus or minus maybe the islands of the western parts of Kadavu, sort of located here, are part of the Western communalex. Now, what communalex are are sort of language. Give me a second. I lost my. Where was I? Yeah, so um, they're sort of parts of a shared and a multi eligible language. So they understand one another, but they also have very distinct forms from one another. Um, but all of these languages are sort of found on a local level. So whether it be a village, a couple of villages, um, they all sort of share unique features, but in the grand sort of understanding of the communalect, they're all intelligible from one another. So when you look at this sort of range, that's the Western communalect and literally everything else found within Fiji. So Ratama, Eastern Viti Levu, Vanua Levu, and the Lau Island group, those are all a part of the Eastern communalect. Now that seems, a little bit, that seems very interesting to me because of the fact that, considering that all these islands, still play a part or still have some semblance of mutual intelligibility, the disparity between the Eastern and Western communalects are as great as English and German are, to each other. So Schutz in 1972 sort of analyzed 200 items on 200 items of the Eastern and Western communalects, and sort of pinpointed that it's roughly 58% intelligibility, compared to languages like Italian and French, which are 73% intelligible, and French and Spanish 79%. That really seems odd to say that they are, in all essence, communalects or languages from one similar language from one another, when other language which are clearly delineated and separate from one another share a closer tie to one another than these Eastern and Western Fijian communalects do. And yeah, that's something that I found really, really interesting and fascinating when I studied that. And then sort of moving on from that, let's look at the zooarchaeology. Now, zooarch is something that I've only recently come into contact with, but is a very, very fascinating and important subject to the Fijian Islands, as well as to the rest of the Pacific Islands. Because of their distance, because of their isolation, a lot of the ecosystems within the Pacific Islands are very, very enclosed and very, very specialized from one another. So the Fijian Islands are typical of other oceanic islands, as they have highly specialized and highly fragile ecosystems. The slight introduction of, let's say, invasive species can totally destabilize their ecosystem's balance, and show, and does in fact show, a huge turnover of several specialized species, including those of megafaunal amphibian, avian, and reptilian species. Now, there was a lack of megafaunal mammalian species, but that's sort of a general trend throughout the Pacific as well, showing more avian species dominating, these specific islands. Now, one key or two key species that I've encountered throughout my study of Fiji that really played a detrimental role to the faunal balance within Fiji are these two culprits: the barn owl and the Pacific rat. Now they're sort of intermittently tied with one another, as one sort of followed the other, and one of them was brought with the help of humans. Now, the Pacific rat, like almost all rat species throughout the world, were brought to these islands by humans. Now, while most tended to be brought sort of unintentionally, stowaways on ships, brought to the New World and stuff like that, the Pacific rat actually has evidence of being purposely brought to the Pacific Islands, possibly acting as a food source or maybe something along the lines. Now, with that being said, how are they so dangerous? Is because of the fact that they didn't have any predators. Even to this day, a lot of invasive species are very dangerous to island ecosystems, especially because of the fact that they have no natural predators. Species genuses and species like Pacific rats and rats in general have a high reproductive rate and a short lifespan, meaning that they can just outnumber local species so much faster than they can adapt to, the turnover rate. And, with rats being omnivorous, eating almost anything that they can get their hands on, bird species, laying their eggs in rather fortunate positions and places for rats to reach. Same thing with reptilians and amphibians. They stand little to no chance against these vermin and invasive species. Now, the barn owl plays, a similar role without any natural predators, although they are much slower in their reproductive rate and don't necessarily overtake with such ferocity as species such as the Pacific rat. They still cause a danger to endemic species, hunting endemic species as well as invasive species. And actually, that was one of the cause of why the barn owl came to the island of Fiji in the first place. Because barn owl middens. So, as for those who know a little bit about the diet of owls, they eat their prey whole, but they can't digest everything whole. Can't digest every part of the animal. So they regurgitate bones, they regurgitate fur, and you could find their pellets, and scattered throughout, various sites, which when condensed and sort of found in the archaeological record, we call owl middens. Now, scattered throughout these middens are bones of invasive species such as rats, but also endemic bird species. So, these two in tandem with one another can do real harm to local ecosystems, and has been done so to the ecosystem of Fiji. Much so that there's a clear sort of, well, not necessarily clear, but tangentially, and some have argued, show a clear delineation of a faunal turnover in conjunction with the arrival of humans. Now, sort of on a similar sense, the paleoecology sort of tells a similar story as well. So looking at charcoals, phytoliths, and core samples, so that being, huge cores coring from places like swamps, which have, a detailed account of the history of the island, tell a distinct story of the arrival of humans. Increased level of certain plants being harvested and planted, increased amounts of charcoal due to the fact that humans cook with fire. These things can be seen in the archaeological record and have to some extent showed that in what traditional archaeobotanical studies have shown in Fiji. But also other interesting facts that that have come up, and rather new and inventive studies have tried to argue for, is for the diets of these ancient Fijians. Now, what that really tried to show was that the Fijians used a mixture of uh, brought elements such as yams and taros, but also that they utilize a lot of local terrestrial sources, so endemic fruits and endemic plants, and even a lot of marine resources, fish, clams, any sort of fish, uh, any sort of water based marine sources, most especially estuary. That played an important role in their diets. So, with a mixture of these, sort of lines of evidence, you could sort of start to see that, they really, really had or they sort of gained this intimate knowledge of the land as they sort of started to become familiar with it. Um, Although there are some sites that show a general trend from the use of marine sources and then move into terrestrial sources on a gradual scale, nothing too dramatic, over time, not a sudden appearance of, let's say, the tower route and then everything changed. It was a rather gradual change, and even some sites had, a very, very heavy influence of uh, terrestrial sources, and it continued so, throughout its occupational periods. But yeah, it was a really interesting sort of dynamic between the usage of um, inland sources, terrestrial sources, and then marine sources. And although there's still a lot of studies to be done about this, um, it seems really, really interesting to see that these people use what they had available to them. It isn't as simple as oh, they brought uh, their own um, tool set, their own farming tools, their plants, and they just settled there according to their way. No, they utilized everything to the best of their abilities, and they settled Fiji properly. They cultivated the land, they adapted to the changing environments, and really got accustomed um, to the landscape um, that was provided to them. And one of the last sort of lines, looking at the archaeology. So the archaeology of Fiji is really, really important, especially in arguing for its identity on sort of two levels. One, sort of in reference to its internal trade and internal dynamics, but also in terms of its greater reach in the Pacific. So I sort of use two types of artifacts to argue for both. So first is ceramic. Ceramics being one of the more survivable elements in the archaeological record, has a lot to say about the inter-island Fijian trade networks. The various typologies that were made and dated and set to chronological order, but also more importantly, the petrographic analysis of these ceramics showed a really interesting percentage of locally made and imported, or at least inter-Fijian imported trade networks, because the percentage was roughly 70% locally made and 30% still Fijian, but not of that island. And even throughout the various cultural occupations and cultural horizon or site occupations, to some extent, there was that percentage, and yeah, it was really, really, at least obvious to me that yeah, that makes sense. With the continual trade, movement of people, and contact that they had with one another, why wouldn't they trade with one another? Um, trade a pot for some food. You're lacking some ingredients for this thing. I'll give you this. That's sort of the the very standard understanding of trade networks in archaeology. But it really does show that even without the sort of traditional land borders or um, land networks that I was familiar with in classics. um, the sea works just as well as these trade routes, as as the road is under our feet. And that was really, really interesting to me. Now, on top of that, obsidian artifacts were of great importance uh, to the external trade network of Fiji, because Fiji has no known sources of obsidian. So to have obsidian found in Fijian sites must have come from the outside. Now, there are two sort of main sources according to where the obsidian artifact was found. Now, granted, there weren't too many obsidian artifacts found in Fijian sites, but their sort of inclusion in later horizons sort of indicated that these networks were long lived. Maybe their frequency and the amount of times these routes were traveled weren't that often, but the fact that it happened 100, maybe 200 to 500 years after the initial settlement of Fiji indicated that there was still a strong network of people moving throughout the Pacific. So obsidian found in Western spheres would have originally arrived from the Bismarck archipelago. It probably would have traveled through other island groups such as Vanuatu, but the closest Western and most probable Western site would have been the Bismarck archipelago, sort of found. Oh, that's not it. Give me a sec. Where is it? Yeah, sort of found right here. And yes, the eastern site, which would have been sourced from the island of Nuatoputapu. Forgive me for my butchering of that word. Would have been found right here. Now, originally, I thought that would have been a part of the Tongan Empire, but again, Dr. Polly pointed out that it is its own sort of island nation or island identity, separate from its sort of modern association with the islands of Samoa and Tonga. Now, again, that might not say much to those who don't understand the full picture, but that means that these networks would have been greatly important to one another because of the fact of its distance from Fiji. So if you sort of look at the scale, uh, it already shows that these islands can be very distant from one another, and they have historically been uh, uh, their occupational periods have been spaced out hundreds of years from one another, especially within the Central Pacific region. Um, as early the latest possible date for Fiji would have been 2,950 BP, and then the islands of Samoa and Tonga as early as as early as 2,800 BP. So although there would have been some time from which these populations would have initially settled these islands, they're not so distant but not so close proximity to one another would have been of great significance in the way that they traded with one another. And that just shows that there is evidence for this with the appearance of obsidian at later occupational periods. Oh, yeah. Oh, let's go back here. And then the last sort of two, I just sort of quickly glossed over. But they show a really interesting picture of Fiji. Although, um, the use of ethnoarchaeology and cultural anthropology, can have often, sort of been the secondary purposes of archaeologists, linguists, and geneticists, mostly due to the fact that these islands were colonized and their indigenous societies and cultures have been greatly affected by, the um, the cultures of their European colonizers. But I think there's still an important through line that we could take from these various disciplines. While not every aspect of their current culture and society is traditional, there are certain aspects that that still follow from this traditional line, and one of those being cuisine. So, for example, certain dishes and especially eating habits of traditional Fijians are very hierarchical and still follow a rather gendered role when it comes to things. But it could say a lot about certain values and um, certain important roles that were played importance to traditional Fijians. And certain culinary preparation styles, such as the Fijian lovo, which is an earth oven, also plays to that strength. Now you can argue for whether these can be used as direct correlates, but I think it's still important to include them nonetheless into this discussion, because what's the point of studying these people who have a very lived experience of their identity and not include them today. So even though just a short look into into the ethnoarchaeology and cultural anthropology of Fiji, it might be something that I'll look more into, especially if I do field work there, which it's something that I thought of but isn't 100% sure yet. So to sort of wrap things up, where do we stand? Yeah, so with all this sort of different aspects uh, from its genetic history, linguistic history, the archaeology, the paleoecology, the zooarchaeology, what can we really sort of say about Fiji? Now, although you could argue about the way that I employed all of these different sources of evidence, one thing that I sort of hope that I convinced you all is that the geography of Fiji is really, really important to its identity. Um, from the admixtures of Melanesian and Polynesian affinities, the really, really interesting and complicated history of its language, the trade of various goods from ceramics within Fiji to obsidian outside in the general Pacific, really shows that people within Fiji were not only developing their own identity in relation to one another in the local Fijian level, but they were also expressing that on the greater Pacific stage. And as people who find themselves at the crossroads of Oceania, I find that really, really interesting and fascinating. So I want to thank you all for your attention. But before I end real quick, I just want to say a special thank you, a very, very heartfelt thank you for Dr. Andrew Pauly. I mentioned before that he looked through my work. But yeah, like it really, really reshaped a lot of the things that I said in my initial paper that were wrong, and a lot of assumptions that I made that weren't necessarily right. So I want to thank Dr. Andrew Powley for correcting a lot of my mistakes that would have been otherwise published in a rather big publication. So I want to thank him for that. And with that, thank you all for your attention.
All right. Thanks very much, JJ. And I think there's for that very great talk. There's already some questions here, but very briefly, maybe I missed this during your lecture. Can I just ask when was the? Oh, by the way, before we start, if there are any questions, you can just press the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and you can raise your hand, or alternatively, you can put your questions on the chat, or you can also ask questions by directly PMing or directly messaging either me or Ara, whose username is AMSPGAR here. So we can read your questions out loud. All right. Again, thank you. Can I just wanted to ask one question. Maybe I missed this. When was the earliest evidence of occupation in Fiji?
In Fiji, although there are some dates that pointed to 3200 BP, the earliest and most commonly accepted date is 2950 BP.
2950 BP. Okay. I have some other questions as well, but I think there's already some questions here. From Dr. Migs Canilao. Great talk, JJ. Apologies if this may be a digression, more directed towards sociopolitical organization. There is some dichotomizing debate whether the classic Tonga Samoa PG polities of AD 1000 to 1780, which are pre and peri-European contact, are either A, chiefdoms or multi-island chiefdoms, or B, a Tonga-centered state. Are you able to comment on this based on your own research?
Yes. Although I didn't delve too much into this, from a lot of the sources that I looked at, actually argued for a Tonga-centered state, and in fact, call it a Tongan empire, because a lot of the sort of influences were mostly unidirectional, going from Tonga to its colonies, so to speak. Although there were some instances of violent interaction, a lot of it was sort of cultural diffusion by way of the Tongan Empire being such an important established trade network. Moving especially towards Samoa and Fiji, there was a lot of influence in the Lau Island group and Rotama especially of Tongan style sociopolitical establishments. I think also certain fabrics and clothing items, certain motifs, and especially Tongan style houses. So yeah, I definitely think it's more of a B, where it's a Tongan-centered state. But yeah, I haven't delved too much into that, so that's where I sort of understand things at the moment.
But this is during the timeline that.
Oh no, yeah, this is way after the initial settlement. So sort of past the initial settlement, as the sort of Polynesians moved further out west, and even sort of returning into New Zealand, because that's a sort of great disparity, I guess, of the way that Polynesians moved into Oceania. Once these people moved out, there was also evidence of them moving sort of back in, and a sort of back migration of these people.
Which makes sense because of course the people are going back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
I have more questions, but I think there's a question here from Pao. Maybe call him Pao. She says here that looks like you had a lot of fun learning about Fiji prehistory. She would like to add some few notes on the island biogeography parts. Okay. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Pao.
Hey, JJ.
Hi, Pao.
Hey, Anna. Hello, everyone. Hi. Actually, two things. So, una yung island biogeography. So, I think it was really very interesting that you were able to go through some of the work for the island biogeography of Fiji, Fiji Islands. I think, is it Fiji Islands? All the
Yes,
islands.
I think the proper term is Fiji Islands.
Yeah, hindi ko rin alam, friend. Bago din ako dito. Pero I was very impressed that you were able to touch on the very important island biogeography that is very unique to far away and isolated islands such as the Fiji set of islands, its neighbors Vanuatu, and Samoa. So all those islands, they share something very important, which you have touched on, but I'd like to discuss more with you and the rest of the audience is that these islands, what's unique about them, and you've mentioned this, is that they lack predators. Now, I'd like to emphasize that because what JJ meant was that they did not have big predators like lions and tigers. So that's also something that's shared with the Philippines.
Mhm.
We also don't have giant cats, with the exception of Palawan, and only Palawan in a very specific time and nothing else. So that's something that we share all around as an isolated island, kasi isolated island din ng Pilipinas. And what's more is that these groups of islands do not have megafauna. If you've noticed, no one talks about pig, cow, bovid, deer. They also don't have that because they lie east of Lydecker Line. So anything beyond Lydecker Line, mawawala na lahat ng megafauna. They also don't have the elephants that we have. So hindi masyadong diverse yung island biogeography nila. Kaya naman, sinabi ni JJ kanina, na I also like to emphasize this, that any introduction is is always really very bad. So any introduction of any kind of animal that they are unused to is very bad because of these two situations. Wala kang megafauna at wala kang megapredator. They do have something that is a predator. They do have a predator, but it's not mammal. They do have a giant crocodile, the crocodile of your nightmares. They have that, which we also have, the man. So aside from that, they really didn't know how to cope with the introductions of possibly rats. I'm not sure about the owls, but makikita sa archaeology and even in the zooarchaeology faunal remains only deposits in caves, of which majority of the studies of the archaeofauna is within caves, it's cave sites, is talagang nawindang yung mga birdies kasi dati sila lang. Tapos may others. So they didn't really know how to do it. And then with the inclusion of the migrations of the anatomically modern humans into the islands, they had nothing else to eat because there's no megafauna. So they ate the birds. And so the birds, they went extinct. And basically that is the history of the island biogeography of the Fiji Islands. Someone came in, ate all the birds, and now they have rats because the rats came in as well with the humans. And I actually believe that. And these are really remote islands, and that's why it's precarious. And in terms of archaeology, and a lot of people, I think, don't realize that the animals, the composition of the animals, the biogeography of the island pre-human will actually tell you a lot about the human impact afterwards. Because if you don't know what happened before, then you wouldn't really be able to test what happens after. So I think that the portion of the JJ's talk on that is very refreshing and actually very important. And I'm glad that it found its way there. And lastly, not island biogeography. I don't know if you've read this, JJ, but you might be very interested in this. There's actually a new study on the Fiji shell beads. This is 2019. Okay, ito archaeology na talaga. So remember, they have no megafauna and no major predator. What to eat? Birds. Oh, birds, they're small. Not enough food to eat. What to do? Eat the yam. But the yam, it's not protein. So what else should they eat? They ate the shells. So there's several studies on the shells, and a lot of people were like so windang. They didn't understand what's going on. The diversity of the shell collected by all the sites have seemingly no pattern. And then later on, sabi nila, baka that's the pattern. The lack of pattern is the pattern. Wherein, after many, many years, amina na tayo na they were not selectively hunting the shells. And they were wondering why it was so, because all the other islands, including Vanuatu, had actually practiced selective hunting of, or gathering of shells. So ang napagtanto nila, hindi sila namimili kasi walang panahong mamili. They just got what they wanted, they needed. They got what they needed. So accessibility is a factor, knowledge of the shell itself is a factor, etc. But in general, what you see, you eat what you get. Kung ano siyang makita, siyang luto. With the exception of the last 300, maybe 400, 500 years, with the arrival of the, with the recovery of the shell beads. This is one of the very few cultures, hindi na kasama ang Pilipinas, pati tayo hindi tayo gumagawa nito. Because, baka gumagawa tayo, but we don't know because we don't have the evidence. They have drill bits that are made out of stone tools. So lithic material as drilling, not for anything else, but specifically for shells. And they were able to recover that from a workshop, which means that because they had nothing to eat, not really nothing to eat, but not a lot of choices, but to eat the shells, they were able to gather enough knowledge and decide that these shells, because we know them so well, maybe they can be beads. Maybe that's how it is. But the new research on this is, as I've said, very new. And there's a lot to say and go for it still, because it's just really starting. Their archaeology also is really, really new and not very diverse. I have to say that. But, they're just starting like we were 20 years ago. This is what we looked like. And it's nice to see that they're progressing now. And you can actually see how far we have gone in archaeology since 20, 30 years ago. Yun lang. Okay, congratulations, JJ. Good job.
Thank you, Pao. Yes, and also thank you very much for the article. That is something that I will definitely read up on. But also sort of, you congratulating me on including the paleoecology. It's not really thanks to me, honestly. It's thanks to this article or this work, this publication in the Terra Australis series, the early prehistory of Fiji, because Clark and Anderson, really, really did a good job in condensing a lot of the studies and material, including, a lot of paleofaunal and also, study of shells, fish remains that I didn't really touch upon. But, kudos to them, for doing that, because it really, really was a really good source for me to read up on.
I think there's another. Thank you for that, Pao. I think there's another question from Dr. Victor Paz.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. And I'm glad to hear from Pao. And I'm glad, Pao, that you're reading for your dissertation, and you're excited about what you read. But kudos to JJ for writing this paper and submitting it for submission. So my first question, JJ, is this already submitted, and where are you publishing this?
Yes, it's already submitted. It's currently under the editing process. I've submitted my response to the first round of edits, and I've also sort of got the help of Dr. Polly on the side. So his revisions have also been taken into account on the current draft. But the current timeline is I should be receiving the second round of edits sometime in August, if there are any. and the publication timeline should sort of end with the publication with the CASA proceedings, roughly beginning of February of
What is
2020.
CASA? I'm sorry.
Yeah, CASA. That is the Cambridge. I always forget what it stands for.
Archaeological.
Yes, yes,
Group?
yes.
Yeah. Is it so it's okay, so it's still in the process. So I just the listening to you very carefully, I gathered that what you did was a review of
Mhm.
literature, and very clearly you reviewed it, and you categorized the evidence, the known data for you on the ethnogenesis of the Fijian cultures as we know it now. And I'm glad that you got in touch with Andy Pauli. He is very good historical linguistic and a friend of our community for a long time. He's now well retired, of course, but still very active. Glad to know that he's helping you very much. But I have a series of small questions to in an attempt to perhaps further polish your paper, and that's well, Pau's good in putting in in more contemporary, recent publications. Uh, so my questions are because you will know this from the top of your head. Did you um, did you use the publication or the accounts of the first American scientific expedition, the exploration expedition of 1838 1842, which the head of this expedition was very controversial, Wilkes, Captain Wilkes, published it around 1845. No? Uh, have you encountered this? Because if you haven't, it would be great to include it. No? And you will find it very. You just you know why this is important, because especially for the Americans, the foundation, the core, the building block of the Smithsonian collection for the Pacific, focus on Fiji, came from this expedition. So it's quite significant. No? So just look it up under Wilkes, Wilkes, and then just type exploration expedition, United States, and it will bring you, and you can download the the original publications. It's wonderful. I think it's under the Smithsonian web page. But I suggest if you can put that in. You don't have to read the entire thing, no, but it's good reading though,
Mhm.
especially you're interested in because it is a very rich description of Fijian culture back in the early 19th century. And they, in fact, two of their crew got killed. Two of their crew got at that time, and it was very controversial. But at the end, it was worth every dollar that they spent. This six ship fleet expedition. So the other thing is Jacques Barrault, who is a pioneer, well, not really a pioneer, but one of the first modern ethnobotanical research done in the entire Pacific, and focus again around the Fijian archipelago. Um, he is something that if you haven't encountered him, will be something that you can cite for to support your biogeographic um, synthesis, which takes me to a suggestion. Because in your talk, and I don't know if it's the same as the paper, you discuss synthesis of the genetics, then the linguistics, then zooarchaeology, then archaeobotany, and then you went to archaeology again, no? So I mean, somehow maybe it's a subconscious, JJ, that for you archaeology is the ceramic remains and the obsidian, but the zooarchaeological remains and the archaeobotanical data set are not archaeological. Of course, I know you know it is, but I think it's a subconscious thing in terms of your background training that you subdivided it as such. No? So perhaps you just the easiest way to correct it is to use Pau's suggestion of rather than labeling it under biogeography, because the questions of that most of this research in zooarchaeology and archaeobotany are biogeographical questions, which you are very much interested, central to your concern of ethnogenesis. So the movement of, so these are proxy evidences that are being used to argue for ethnogenesis and interaction, etc. So then I noticed, and maybe it's just because of time, but that you didn't focus too much on motifs, right?
Mhm.
That is represented in the material culture of the current and or maybe the antique, in the 19th century from the collections across the different islands, and the different groups in Fiji, and of course folklore and what their folklore tells us about their ethnogenesis. So what are they telling us? So how are they telling that? What is their narrative when it comes to where did they come from? Huh? So so uh, as I mentioned earlier, if it's all just a question of polishing it, then are things that you can. And it seems that you're still interested in the Pacific to remember for your next article. But if you can still put it in or correct this, um, I suggest you do.
Mhm.
But don't lose sleep from
Yeah.
this. So, I mean, if it's already been passed and it's been it went through reviews and they agree with it, then it's okay. So what I'm saying is something to think about for the next article that definitely you'll be writing.
Mhm.
And the last thing is, did you encounter the 2016 Nature paper or the genetics ancient DNA paper that Matthew Spriggs was one of the authors, of course, because they use that Vanuatu site with the three heads. So that the famous excavation that they did, where they excavated this the individual that was buried with two extra heads, not scouts. And this is a very. Have you encountered this, Jay? Have you
No,
seen that?
I
Okay,
I don't
so
think I have.
okay, this is very important that because this is ethnogenesis again. No? This is direct dating of the burials. Two, one in Vanuatu and the other one in what's the other island? For let's say the hold on, let me see. Vanuatu and in Tonga, no,
Mhm.
Tonga Island, and and they. What is important about this because for the first time they extracted ancient DNA by drilling, no, by taking the sample from the hard part of the I think of the maxilla where the ear is located. There's a name for that, but don't ask me what at the moment. And they successfully extracted ancient DNA. And then with the date of 3000 BP, uncalibrated, they argued they saw that the DNA of these individuals that were buried in Vanuatu and in Tonga were very much in line with the microsatellite signals that we see from the populations that are in the Philippine Islands.
Mhm.
So this is like a affirmation of the argument of the ethnogenesis of of early populations in the islands of the Pacific from the Philippine Islands to the southern islands, Southeast Asian to Melanesia, and the Pacific. So that would be something that you should look up.
Yeah, thank you, Survey.
All right. So really, are you going to the Pacific? Your interest, or this is just one of your many interests? Of course.
One of my many interests coming to ASP. I think
from the very beginning, you were already thinking of the Pacific. This is good.
Yes,
because we need this connection,
Mhm.
and the scholarship in the Pacific has never waned from the 1950s. They have their own journals, no? And they and just to think about, let's say, Easter Island, no, Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui has its own journal, and we have a complete set from the beginning until Professor Solheim passed away. No, because they gave him a copy of Rapa Nui every time it came out. No? So it is in our library. So if you look at our the ASP library, on the top floor, all those unused journals from the Puzzole, there are several more journals there that you can plumb for further information.
Thank you, Sir Vic.
Yeah, thanks.
So you're getting a lot of resources, JJ.
Yes, a lot of new resources that I haven't seen before.
Good. And I think it's a good start then for, especially when you're looking at ethnogenesis, because it's very important to look at what's been done before. Yes, go ahead, Sir Vic.
Notice that Mike Herrera is not with us, no?
No,
Jay,
I think he has a class.
Jay, do you know that Dr. Herrera did a lot of population genetics work on owls, yeah, I think, and rats, no? That included the Pacific. So,
No, in fact, Sir Vic, this paper comes from his class.
Oh, there you go. Then
298 Pacific Islands class.
Surely you have a comprehensive citation of that. Yeah, no problem.
So it's just too bad that Mike isn't here because he's in a class right now. So he wanted to listen to your talk, friend. All right. Are there any other questions? I have another question. So the pottery that you were looking at, this is also associated with the 2,950 BP initial occupation dyan sa, well, one of the occupations dyan. So when they dated the 2,950 BP, that was based on, what is it based on? Is it based on pottery? Is it based on
I think
archaeological materials?
It is definitely on archaeological materials. I forget specifically what they dated. It might have been charcoal or something along those lines. But again, those stratigraphic horizons were associated with ceramics. A lot of the early ceramics, sort of came along with, the Lapita cultural complex, but then, quickly sort of turned into, localized versions. I didn't really have time to get into them, and I actually didn't do too much of the stylistic analysis in my paper. But yeah, they have their own phase as early and then moving as late as 100 BP to present. So their ceramic industry is still very much alive to this day.
Yes. Are they also, most of the artifacts that were found there, are they settlements or burials yung mga inanalyze?
I think most that I've encountered were a mix. Some of the big ones and initial ones were in fact burial sites, but others and more recent ones were occupational sites as well. Mostly coastal. I don't think they sort of figured or they haven't found too many inland sites just yet. But yeah, hopefully to come in the future.
Okay. All right. Yes, Sir Vic. Oh, Sir Vic, you're
muted.
Jay, did you look into the work of Patrick Kirch?
Yes, Kirch was one of my
dry and wet, right? Dry and wet. But that's Hawaiian island. Then if you're going to pursue this further, we have direct evidence for early sweet potato, no sweet potato.
Mhm.
Uh, Very nice, solid evidence because you don't. They found charred and desiccated remains in the Pacific and very early. That's John Hatter, and another synthesis is oh my goodness, what's his name again? Oh, I keep forgetting. Never mind. I'll tell you when I see you next time. It's at the top of my head. It's important anyway.
Mhm.
Speaking of food na associated sa ethnogenesis, are they mostly, so you mentioned that they were mostly eating uh, yams, but they were, for when it comes to the shells, they weren't really specialized, or they weren't really specifically picking a particular type of shell or particular types of shell. So in earlier on.
I look at how it's
for giving the time to sharing this with us, because it's very interesting, and it's actually very what we found. This is
UP, and then
things. Well, I don't know anything about it, so I would be interested to hear more. All
so
right.
Anna, is it 1 o'clock? Is it
Uh,
at 1 o'clock or
it will be at 2 p.m. because of the time difference. Yes, next week. All right. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this morning's Binalot Talk. Thank you, JJ. for this giving this talk, and we will see you next week.